Can Jacobson do some announcing here? He's got that radio voice. No, not to cut anyone else off.
Well, let Senator Sales direct track.
I'll start our meeting.
So Susan, we got everybody we need here.
I don't see Senator Stresso yet or Representative Dugan.
Well, we'll let them join at a later date. I just want to, thank our staff for putting this little meeting together for us. The purpose of this, I spoke to a couple different legislators regarding, all the different moving parts of what's going on in our country and state regarding the COVID-19 quote unquote pandemic and the associated federal money that is coming our way. And I was hoping maybe with the help of our staff, we could all end up on the same page in terms of knowing a little bit better or a little bit more about what that means in terms of how that money could be potentially used and whether or not it would need legislative oversight or all those different things that pertain to this. We have had a little bit of public comment that's come in via email, and I appreciate that. This isn't a normal type of meeting in terms of where we have a specified agenda for potential policy that might be considered by the legislature at a later date. We're not going to have public comment entered into the record. That's already been done via email, and we're going to leave it at that. So with that, Susan, I'm going to turn it over to you. I don't know if we think it's necessary for us to take roll, but we'd like to hear from you folks that have been taking a peek at the nuts and bolts of this funding that's coming from the feds.
Thank you, Senator Sales. I just want to give a few technical things. If people want to see who's on the call, if up in the upper right, if you put it on gallery view, it's kind of like the Brady Bunch. You get to see everybody. And then you can scroll to the second page. If you want the participant list, as you scroll down, you'll see it says manage participants. You can click on that and you'll be able to see the list of the people to the right. There's also a chat function if you want to send a private chat or information to all people. So I think Todd had written a memo last week, and I think we'll have him just give you a quick overview of that. I think most of you have that. If not, it's on the website for everybody and the public. Under the COVID-19 website, on the left-hand column, there's some frequently asked questions, and that's where the legislator information is. So I'll hand this over to Todd. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. President, members of legislative leadership, for the record, my name is Todd Everts, Chief Legal Counsel for the Montana Legislature. I also have the following staff attorneys from Legal Services that are hooked into this Zoom meeting: Jarrett Coles, Julie Johnson, Ginger Aldrich, Laura Sankey-Kite, and Jameson Walker. So last week, we started receiving questions from legislative leadership regarding the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act, and the funding that would be allocated to the state of Montana. In order to address these questions, we worked with our fiscal analyst and her staff, and we also contacted Senator Daines' staff and Senator Tester's staff via conference calls. I'd note that both Senator Daines' staff and Senator Tester's staff were extremely helpful in answering our questions, and will continue to provide us with some updates on the implementation and the disbursement of the CARES funding to the state of Montana. So specifically, we were asked to analyze provisions of the CARES Act to determine whether legislative action is required by the state of Montana to make emergency expenditures in accordance with the CARES Act. We provided you with a memo regarding our legal analysis. In sum, state law authorizes that funds received under the CARES Act are statutorily appropriated and therefore no legislative action is required to appropriate those funds for emergency expenditures due to the public health emergency in accordance with the CARES Act. Our memo did not address any stimulus revenue replacement issues or other funding sources outside of the CARES Act, which may need further analysis and also direction from the federal government. So the CARES Act appropriated $150 billion of funding to the states, tribal governments, and certain qualifying units of local government. These monies will be available no later than 30 days after enactment of this act. And in talking to both Senator Daines and Senator Tester's staff, the focus right now is on the Treasury Department and other federal agencies in terms of them promulgating, the rules of, for disbursement, the oversight and monitoring activities of those funds. And so everybody is kind of waiting for those to come down in terms of the implementation of this act. So the amount paid to the state of Montana was the minimum payment allowed under the act of $1.25 billion. The act also provided direct payments to units of local governments if the population of the local government exceeded 500,000 residents. Since Montana doesn't have a qualifying unit of local government over 500,000, the entirety of the 1.25 billion will be dispersed to the state. The act also provides for $8 billion in payments to the tribal governments, and the Treasury Secretary will be working with the Department of Interior Secretary to determine the amounts that are allocated to those tribal governments. So the specific section in the CARES Act, the relief fund, which we analyzed, basically governs the use of those funds. And it provides that state and tribal governments and units of local governments shall use the funds provided under a payment made within the act to cover only those costs of the state, tribal government, or local governments that are necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency that were not originally budgeted for in the most recently approved budget by the state government, and that were incurred between March 1st, 2020 and the end of December 30th, 2020. So the funds received by the state of Montana under that relief fund provision, section 601, again, may only be used for necessary expenditures due to the public health emergency. The funds cannot be used in place of funds that were appropriated by the legislature for addressing public health emergencies. And finally, the funds, again, have to be used between that March 1st period and the end of the calendar year. If it's later determined that the state has failed to comply with the CARES Act and the expenditure of those funds, an amount equal to the amount of funds used in violation will be booked as a debt of the state owed to the federal government. So state law provides for the use of emergency funding received from the federal government, and it authorizes the governor to accept funds received from the CARES Act, and those funds are statutorily appropriated pursuant to Title 17. And again, those funds may only be used for the purposes specified in the CARES Act. So Mr. President, members of leadership, that's kind of a brief overview of our analysis. And again, those funds are statutorily appropriated, so no legislative action is required to appropriate those funds. And I stand for any questions. I know that Amy and her staff will be going over the information that she sent all of you with more details on the funding sources and the pockets of funding in the CARES Act and outside of the CARES Act.
Mr. President, this is Fred Thomas, and I just had a question for Todd, if I might.
Go ahead.
Mr. Everts, I think you've been very clear about what you've laid out here in print and just said. In the allocation and the distribution of monies to the local government sectors, which would be counties, municipals, schools, how does our law allow the governor to allocate that or appropriate those monies to those levels? Obviously, it's in the statutory appropriation, but can you go and drill down on that just a hair further?
Yes, Senator Thomas, Section 10-3-203 that authorizes the governor to accept those funding from the federal government, also authorizes the governor to authorize any officer of the state to receive those funds on behalf of the state. And that's set out in that provision. But I think we're looking into more specifics outside of Section 10-3-203 to see whether there's any further direction, on disbursement of those funds. But that section has a pretty broad authorization for the governor to authorize, again, any officer of the state to receive funds on behalf of the state.
And are we considering a county government to be an officer?
Well, we'll have to take a look at that. County government is considered a part of state government operations, but we'll take a look at that in our analysis.
Okay. Thank you.
President Sales and Mr. Everts, just a follow on to that question, if I may. Given the penalty to the state, if the funds are not used in the manner specified, if the state then allocates those funds to the county governments or to the local governments, is the state responsible for ensuring that those monies are spent at the county level the way they're intended?
I would say the way that the CARES Act is structured, that would probably be the case. But what we're waiting for, Representative Balance, is the guidance from the Treasury Department, on the use and disbursement of these funds to see whether the state would be in violation in terms of its use. And they're being drafted right now.
And President Sales, Todd, just one follow-up in a different area, if I may.
Follow-up.
When we talk about the unfunded expenditures due to the emergency and that being a valid use, there are some areas where we have budgeted, where we track things like caseloads, which is a range of expenditures, and we stay within that range based on our budget. Although the item itself is budgeted, I would guess that the caseload would change dramatically based on this emergency, and we need some flexibility to manage within that and specify what portion of that caseload is due to the emergency and what portion is due to normal budgeting. And then additionally, I did read something about an FMAP change. If we're talking Medicaid, an FMAP change, so tracking all of that, I think is going to get pretty complex.
Yeah, Mr. President, Representative Balance, you're correct. And again, I think a lot of, hopefully, and we talked to both Senator Daines' staff and Senator Tester's staff about these issues that you're raising. They keep telling us that everybody's kind of waiting for guidance on that. But you're right. I mean, the way you laid it out makes sense in terms of what you budgeted for. But if you can show a causal relationship between the uptick in the caseload due to the emergency, then that causal link would be, I would think, from a legal perspective, legitimate, a legitimate expenditure, under the CARES Act.
Further questions? Seeing none?
Senator Sales, would you like Amy Carlson to go over the information that she provided?
Absolutely. Let's hear from Ms. Carlson.
Great, thank you. And there you go.
Okay, I think I got it now. So hello, everyone. We've been obviously working with Todd's group and trying to sort out, kind of our side of this equation. I've also been working with the Legislative Finance Leadership, the Fiscal Division, or the Fiscal Finance Committee Management Advisory Work Group to try to figure out, like, what do you all need as legislators in something that we could provide? So we've kind of got to start here. And I drafted, and you will see the memo that kind of outlines what we anticipate providing, and obviously feedback from you over the course of this longer period will be necessary, and it will change as we get more information, and we get more feedback from you on what you need and want. But as you can see, we kind of laid out, general fund and other revenues impacted, federal legislation, and what the impacts are there. We have a specific sheet that Quinn will go over with you in a moment of, what those federal impacts are. And then what's going to happen to cash, although we learned something this morning that will significantly affect cash. And then impacts to the general fund, budget stabilization, reserve, fire fund, et cetera. What budget change documents, so the executive needs to document the budget changes that they do in response to COVID-19. So we will report to you what those are. Expenditures, any Medicaid enrollment changes that we can track and watch for those types of changes. Unemployment insurance benefits distributed and reporting out on what that looks like. We have local government and schools down. I'd say right now we don't know exactly what kind of information we can find there, but we will look to see what we can report on those two items for you, whether it's the governor's distribution to either of those or other federal mechanisms that distribute money to those items. But we can give you summaries and report out on that. I'll say that all of this information, well, especially the federal information, we have just gotten 2 new updates this morning that are not incorporated into our documents yet. They do add quite a bit of color to what this looks like. So we'll be, giving you maybe hints of what that looks like, but we really don't have it incorporated into these documents yet because we got them like a half an hour ago. But we will maintain updates to those items. One thing in particular that I'll just mention before I turn it over to Quinn and let him go through the individual grant items is that the big item, the 1.25 billion, we just learned this morning that is the intention of the Treasury is to have states deposit that in their general fund. So clearly they're going to have to track that carefully, but that is their intention, is that they get deposited in the general fund, which definitely gives us a lot of cash flexibility. So cash wouldn't really be an issue. I put cash on here because I did that last week when I didn't know that it was going to go in the general fund, but definitely that $1.25 billion will infuse a lot of cash for cash flow purposes in the state general fund regardless. So that will make it the state more nimble really in addressing any issues. It's just documenting exactly where that was spent, and obviously we would be tracking that in the presentation that I just outlined for you. Then it probably makes sense to go ahead and let Quinn go through his stuff, and then you can ask us both questions maybe after Quinn goes through the specific grant sheet. So I kind of went over the short memo that is posted out there and kind of what that report structure might look like in the future. Quinn has like a specific thing on table that you'll see that will lay out individual grant items. And again, we will be updating this as we learn more. So I'll turn it over to Quinn.
Okay, thank you, Amy. As Amy mentioned, we're still working on this. Staff has spent a lot of time trying to dig into this as quickly as possible. And as you'll see in this sheet, there's still a lot we don't know, but I'll try to tell you what we do know as well. Before I get into what we put together, I just want to point out that one of the things that was included in your packet for this meeting was the NCSL COVID overview. And I would encourage you to look at that. I'm not going to go through that in detail, but the nice thing about that one is that it looks at the entire $2 trillion package and kind of gives it a high level where that money is going. As far as the spreadsheet that I'm going to be looking at, it focuses on a subset of that information, and really it's the funding that will go through the state. So for instance, you have the direct stimulus payments to individuals. You will not see that reflected in this table anywhere because that does not run through the state. That's direct to individuals, and so that's not being included at this point in time. So with that, hopefully you have in front of you, there's a 3-page PDF that has kind of a spreadsheet layout on it, and I'll walk through kind of how that's laid out for you. But I'll just reiterate, many rules, like Amy mentioned, the federal rules are still in development, so we're still kind of looking at guidance on those and how things get done in the end. The other thing with this is that another difference between this and what you're looking at NCSL, the NCSL specific one is specific to the third bill in the series of 3, which is the $2 trillion bill. There's actually been 3 bills that impact, and I think everyone's probably aware of that, but we've included some information from all 3 in here. So you'll see kind of in the middle of this as to which legislative vehicle those are, and they're in order of 1, 2, and 3, as you might hear them more commonly referred to as, but they have their actual reference number there as well. So I guess I'd like to kind of use some examples and talk through this a little bit, because while there are things we're certainly still learning, there are some things we do know, and I'll use some of these as examples to kind of walk through this spreadsheet with you and show you what we have in here and how it's laid out. So I want to start with an example from Bill 1, which is HR 6074, and that was the initial bill that was put out to provide direct relief, mostly, well, in Montana, what it did, and I'll point you to where that is first. It went through public health and safety. So on page 2, as you look down about halfway through, you'll start to see where we rep on the far left, you see HHS. The first HHS, and then in parentheses CDC, so grants to states, localities, and tribes. So when we look at that and look across, there's an X under the first column and the third column. So there's actually funding both in that first bill and again in this latest bill that has the $2 trillion package with a combined total of almost $2.5 billion that will be put out through HHS CDC. What we do know there already at this point, following across in the next column, Montana has received $4.6 million, and that was from the first bill that went through Public Health and Safety Lab. They processed the budget amendments to do that. But even within that 4.6 million, a portion then from Public Health and Safety is being directed to the tribes. So that's not, an example of where they are using this money to put it into a state budget, federal funding, and then process some of it out to another entity as well. So that BA has been processed. that funding was put in place right away. So there's an example, kind of walking through one line, but specific to Bill 1 of something that's going on there. To follow up on Bill 2, and this was kind of referenced already in the conversation earlier, but just below that in the shaded light blue area, you see there's HHS and then CMS, which is Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services there in parentheses. The second line says Medicaid CHIP FMAP adjustments. And so in the second bill, we did get an FMAP increase. It's approximately a 6% increase. This one's a little harder to kind of understand, calculate. It's open-ended at this point. So you'll see as we put in there approximately $80 million that could be an impact to the state of Montana. However, we had to make some assumptions to come up with that. That would be a full year if we were to get that increased FMAP for a full year. But that FMAP increase is temporary. So depending on when the disaster is declared over, and that's through not necessarily a president or governor, but that's through CMS, HHS, as to when the director of HHS declares the disaster over. So that's a little bit, it's very much dependent on some timeliness and what happens and as things move forward. Obviously, the other thing, and I think this is Representative Balant's question alluded to this earlier, this would be assuming kind of a consistent caseload. So if we see as a result of unemployment and increased eligibility and see an increased caseload that qualifies through Medicaid, then there would be an increased federal amount coming to the state, but there would also be increased state expenditures. And so I think that's the question that was alluded to earlier as to would those qualify? And I think Mr. Everts referred to that and tried to answer that there. So then finally, I want to move on to looking at Bill 3. Most of what's in this spreadsheet is specific to Bill 3. There's a lot in Bill 3, but if you scroll all the way to the bottom here, the big thing that's in there, second line from the bottom, is the $150 billion that is for the coronavirus relief fund. And Mr. Everts spoke to this one specifically, and the $1.25 billion that is expected to come to the state. And as Amy referenced, this one will be deposited in the general fund. So I think we're still waiting for a lot of guidance on how that will come in. There's some information that hopefully we will continue to get and continue to provide updates as we get it. So that's obviously one of the big ones we'll be following and closely monitoring. In fact, we've already started monitoring and have analysts looking at budget amendments of any type as they're processed and compiling a list of impacts of this situation and the total amount spent and how that's spent. And so we're closely monitoring that already and working on that. The final item at the very bottom I want to point out, because we actually, this was kind of a late addition to this spreadsheet, was that this is generally another aspect of the CARES Act. There's $500 billion in there for a lending fund. And typically when you hear that talked about, it's a lending fund for businesses. But actually, as you look at this, this is a lending fund for businesses, cities, and states. May or may not be used by cities and states to a large degree. We don't know. I think that's, again, going to depend on how Treasury lays out the rules for this, as well as the individual experience when you get out into individual states. So while the $150 billion right above that in the coronavirus relief fund is not to be used to replace lost revenues, there is the potential that states or other local entities, governments could use this lending fund as a potential assistance for revenue loss. So I think we'll be continuing to monitor and watch and see what happens with that as well. With that, unless there are specific questions, that's all I have at this point. So.
Yeah, I was just gonna make a couple of last comments on that. Quite a bit of the information that Quinn has now and we will continue to get is from a group called Federal Fiscal Information for the States. We subscribe to that service like we subscribe to IHS econometric facility or company. So we have more information and we technically can share that with legislators. We're going to work with FFIS to figure out, because like we do with IHS Market, we send those out monthly. So I would like to be able to figure out how to share that FFIS stuff directly with legislators, but it is copyrighted, so we can't put it on the web, and we can't, and you then as legislators can't forward that on to non-legislators. So we would need to, we're going to work with IHS or FFIS to figure out how they'd like us to do that. And at the same time, we will be using their information to be included to report more publicly. So we're working on the details there. Also, NCSL, and that's the FFIS is the new information we got. And also we got some new information from NCSL, which of course is public information, and we can share that widely, and we will share that widely. So just letting you know that there's more to come on exactly what we can share on that. So.
Mr. President, this is Lou.
Go ahead, Lou.
And just, I can fill in a little bit of detail on just one section as well. Here, I believe it was yesterday morning, all the days have started to blend together. We did dig deeper in the education section. Representative Beatty in Hamilton chairs our little finance section on education, and the interim education committee got together. And so just on the education breakdown that the general showed in this sheet, but the way that when we delved into that deeper, it lays out that K-12 and higher ed, the Governor's Emergency Education Fund is $8.8 million, that he gets some choices for disruptions there. K-12 itself, according to that analysis, will get $41.3 million, largely distributed via the Title 1A grant program, which already has a distribution mechanism. The MUS system will get $26.3 million, the community colleges $1.4 million, and the tribal colleges $1.6 million. And their distribution mechanism will be based upon their student FTE and the number of Pell Grant recipients. And so since education is a fairly big hitter, I figured I'd just add some details on that section.
Thanks, Lou. Questions?
Mr. President, this is Representative Balance again. I have a question for Amy and or Quinn. I'm just thinking through the monies going into the general fund and then thinking about all of the things that are triggered off of that general fund balance. And so obviously, I know you're working through all of this, but we'll have to be sectioning it off so that it doesn't figure into calculations such as budget stabilization reserve fund, fire fund, all of those things.
Yeah, certainly we would track all that. And the executive's really going to need to track that. It'll be of high importance to them as well to keep those funds separated. In the past, how they've done that, and they may choose to do that here, is that they could issue these funds a separate fund number within the general fund. So like the general fund is 01100, this they could do 01103 or something for this fund, and then they could track it specifically how it got spent, which I think they would want to do. But for our fund balance perspective, anyway, that's something we would need to be able to report on how that all impacts.
And I was thinking less of the tracking portion of it and more toward the triggering mechanisms that for things that trigger off of ending fund balance.
The only thing I can think of that triggers off of ending fund balance specifically is a 177140. And that would be the triggering to reduce budgets. And that would be the one that if the governor chose to do that, it would be probably difficult for him to do that one thing. I don't know that he would want to do that under this circumstance anyway. So I think, but it's something to see and track and calculate. And I definitely think we're going to want to know exactly what's happening. And I hope that we would be reporting on that. It's just there's a lot I don't know yet. So.
Further questions?
Yeah, this is Tom Jacobson. Is it my understanding that these dollars have to be spent by the end of the year?
Senator Jacobson, I think I believe you could accrue the costs so that if a cost was incurred but not spent, that those things could be included in that. That would be my assumption so far. I don't know how accounting wise they would precisely do that. But I would assume that they could accrue those costs and that would be acceptable. I would assume that's acceptable to the federal government.
Mr. President, this is Greg Hertz. I got a question for Quinn.
Go ahead, Mr. Speaker.
Quinn, in regard to the 500 billion in lending fund for businesses, and now you've added cities and states into that. I know businesses have loan forgiveness if they're using it for payroll related type expenditures. Do you know if the cities and states have similar loan forgiveness?
Mr. Speaker, I don't know off the top of my head. I would assume that because of the rules that I've read regarding loan forgiveness are very specifically laid out with specific parameters. So I would assume unless there is specific language for cities and states, which I have not yet seen, that there would not be. But I really have not had the chance, and really that would be a call that I think Mr. Everts and his staff with the attorneys, they probably want to take a look at as well. So short answer is I don't know the answer to that question.
Additional questions?
Mr. President, this is Representative Glenn. I had a question, and part of it is obvious, but so while our education is getting some extra money there, what about private schools? And I realize that we're going to have an issue there with the Constitution, but they're impacted too.
Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
Mr. President, this is Todd Everts. Representative Glim, we can take a look at that for you. We haven't heard any direction about that yet, but we will track that and try to do some analysis and see whether there is a source of funding for private schools or not.
Yeah.
Further questions?
One last one for me, Mr. President. Looking at the governor's emergency fund, it does not appear that there's any linkage between him having to use up his emergency funds before any of these disaster relief funds are used. Doesn't look like there's any connection at all. Is that the case? And I would assume his would be reimbursed for anything that was spent for specific COVID-19 expenses. Is that right?
Representative Balance, Todd Everts, that is correct, at least under our reading of those statutory provisions for the emergency funds, and then also a couple of Attorney General's opinions related to that. So that would be correct.
Okay, and just a quick comment on I was just thinking about Representative Glim's question on private schools. I would think that they would be either private organizations that would fall under any rules that apply to any private business, or nonprofits, which would fall under the nonprofit category.
Any more questions?
Mr. President, one for Amy, if I might.
Representative Jones, go ahead.
Ms. Carlson, Amy, so I was thinking about this early on, prior to your statement here that this is going to be distributed in the general fund, this 1.25 billion, which then raises additional questions. Montana, with its balanced budget amendment, has to maintain its balanced budget, and the delay of the taxes that the state did would to the second quarter would have caused us, in my mind, potential some liquidity challenges. Not that the money wasn't coming, but that the money wasn't coming timely, and so that it would cause some cash flow issues. So your statement, I guess my thought process of that, obviously, I still believe that we're going to have some cash flow issues on that portion of money that was dedicated to do the cash flow that we originally appropriated. Is it your thought at this point in time that the 1.25 billion would be able to, at least for a period of time, offset the cash flow challenge of the deferred income tax date?
Representative Jones, in short, yes. I mean, this was a surprise to me. We got this, like I said, less than an hour ago. So I had been planning on carefully monitoring general fund cash as a result of that delay and some other things, and other revenues that are going to be less, like oil and gas is going to be less, interest is going to be less, accommodations tax is going to be less. So there's multiple things that are all going to impact general fund revenue. But if this fund is available, or this $1.25 billion is available, which it looks like with new information that we just got this morning, it looks like it will be deposited in the general fund, and therefore being able to cash flow all of that, regardless if in the end of the day, it might not be able to be used for revenue replacement, but maybe it's for cash flow in the meantime, which definitely reduces some of the stress on the executive trying to manage the cash part of it in any case. So it would definitely be, I can't think of the accounting term for it, like a reserved part of the general fund, but for cash flow, if it's there, it's there, so. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. It does address, if that is the case and it can be used for this, it does address the what I figured would become we'd accrually have dollars, but we'd have a tough time cash flowing here June, July.
Right.
Further questions?
Mr. Chairman, John Sesso here. I just wanted to make a point about the forgivable loans to local governments and even the state. We should probably want to push for that if there's any way we can. It's our understanding that if the local government or any entity uses loan money for operational costs, it has a direct effect on their bonds, their existing bonds, and their any bonds that they want to sell. Using loans for operational costs is a problem. So I guess we would want to dig down into the bill to make sure that if local governments are given loans, that there is a mechanism for those to be converted to grants sooner than later, so it doesn't sort of screw up their books, if you will, on that issue with bond counsel. So I just make that point, and something that we should maybe try to look at moving forward.
We can definitely report if we're aware of any of that activity, at least happening or not happening, and look at trying to figure out how to at least let you know what's going on there on a regular basis. So.
Further questions, comments?
Mr. President, this is Fred Thomas again. Hey, I really appreciate you having this meeting put together for us. And I really like this format. I so appreciate the talent that's at the table here across the board. But this is a pretty big deal. And I'm going to hope that you and the speaker will put together more of a formal group that would include the talents in the Senate and House of, like Senator Osmundson, Smith, Senator Jones. We've got the talents of Representative Balance and Glim. Plus leadership to kind of formally work with our staff and our Senator Sesso, particularly. We want that dude on there. He's a better example to work with our staff and to work with the executive branch as to what specifically is going to go on here. Senator Jones, mentioned some items that will happen in education. Those are good calculations at this point, but that's a big deal. Where this money goes to our local governments, it's a bit how that has allocated. There's a percentage, there's a process that needs to be developed there to do that. There's just a lot of things, and then there's ramifications down the road. Representative Balance brought up a very key item, is that if these monies aren't properly utilized, who's on the hook for them down the road? And so that's a pretty big question, and it's a very valid concern that we need to make sure we've done everything that we can up front to expedite these monies and think of all the ways that we can get this extraordinary amount of money into the public's hands in a legal way so that we can mitigate as much of the damage to our society that's going on with this coronavirus. I've read these public responses that Ms. Fox has sent to us, and they're awesome. Things that people think of that we want. Ask the broader net and get as much public input as well to fine tune these ideas and bring ideas to the table that we wouldn't have thought of. So I hope you'll formalize something here, including the 4 leaders of the House, Senate, to put something together. That's my hope. Thank you.
Appreciate your input there, Majority Leader. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of conversation going forward.
Yeah.
Additional comments, questions?
This is Casey.
Brad Cheetah. I had a quick question about tribal allocation amounts. Obviously, that's included in the overall 1.25 billion, but is there a specific carve out, or will those monies be allocated based on a per request or as needed basis?
Senator Sales, Representative Cheetah, the tribes have their own allocation of the bigger federal dollar amount. The 1.25 is the state government and state and local government portion of that. So the tribes have a separate allocation.
Thank you. And then a quick follow-up, as far as meetings that we're having, when Representative Jones mentioned the education subcommittee, I presume that the information that Representative Beatty came up with was part of their regular interim committee meeting.
Anybody want to field that question?
Yep, I can, Mr. President. There was a meeting scheduled. It was conference call, not unlike this. It was a joint meeting between the interim committee and the interim education committee and the interim LFC finance education committee. And I'm drawing a blank. I think it was maybe even yesterday morning or the morning before. And so, yes, it was a request for information. Pat presented some of that information, but it was, I don't know who was the generation force behind the creation of it, but correct. It was part of a regular, or a specially scheduled notice meeting.
Further questions, comments?
Mr. President, this is Representative Schreiner. I just want to point out to kind of piggyback off of Senator Thomas's comments. We already have an existing structure that we can handle these questions. We have Legislative Finance Committee that has all the talent that's basically on here there, as well as Legislative Council. I would shy away from doubling up on creating more committees for this topic when we have plenty of time to have those conversations where appropriate, given that as staff has said, the authority for this stuff falls within the executive at this point. So if we want to have those conversations, I'm sure we could have them within the existing structure that we have in a very bipartisan way. So those are my 2 cents.
Duly noted.
Senator Sales, I have a quick question and I guess a comment too. Can you hear me?
Yep, I did. Go ahead.
Okay, Senator Sales, President Sales. This is Jason Ellsworth. And what I'm gathering from this, so we may have not necessarily a cash flow shortage in our budget, but obviously, as Representative Jones, pointed out, that we may have an actual problem with the budget itself, the money that's being brought in. So are we potentially looking at, a special session to deal with the budget itself, since this money can't
Are you still there?
be used? Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
I can now.
Okay, so, since this may help us with cash flow on the general fund, but we may not be able, to reallocate those funds to replace money that's, coming in. So are we looking at a special session at some point to deal with that other issue?
Well, in my opinion, and there's a lot of people here that know the finances way better than I do, but I think it's a little premature to start talking about a special session. Certainly if the revenue doesn't come in, which potentially it won't, if you look at, the economy shutting down in so many different ways, and the price of oil collapsing, and the price of copper collapsing, and so there's a lot of moving parts. I certainly wouldn't think that we could rule it out, but I think it's probably premature to try to say at this point that we're going to have a special session, but it's certainly something we need to be attentive to. Additional comment on that?
Mr. President, this is Nancy Balance. The mechanisms that have been in place, 17-7-140, and others that would alert us to any specific need for a special session to deal with that kind of issue, are active. Same mechanisms we've had. So, clearly keeping an eye on it and seeing what is changing. This is a unique situation, but those mechanisms are there to handle exactly that if we need it. I certainly agree it's way premature to be thinking about whether or not a special session would be needed to handle that.
Mr. President, Lou Jones, I agree entirely with Nancy. At this point, I would obviously have in mind, I always think about the cash flow section. But even then, you could have borrowed from other funds. We entered this, if there's a fortunate part of where the state was when it entered this crisis, it was in a fairly solid fiscal position. It had its budget stabilization reserve full. It had effectively a general fund at 300 million, 291, I believe is the number. And at that point, it was forecasted to go to 400 million. Obviously, we know that the forecast isn't going to happen. The challenge of moving the collection dates doesn't change the obligation on what's owed on last year's money, because it's last year's taxes. Some of the rule changes will impact that. But at this point, it's incredibly premature to think that for that reason, there'll need to be a special session. It appears unlikely for that reason. Now, again, we'll see how long this lasts, how severe it gets, but it's a very premature conversation today.
And Mr. President,
Further questions?
Mr. President,
Go ahead.
Greg Hertz. Just one comment too. When we look at the 1.25 billion and that going into the general fund, I think that truly needs to be segregated from our ending fund balance, so that once we get into the declining revenues, which obviously the obvious ones are coming at us, but it'll also impact withholding taxes, and this might catch up to us a little bit faster. But we truly need to continue to look at 17-7-140, because that will be what will help our budget. Once our revenues start to decline and those kick in, and then we have to do some emergency budget cuts in order to continue with a balanced budget, because yeah, cash flow is great. And although it might look like we're cash rich, all that cash does not belong to us, and it cannot be spent on items that we have budgeted that are not related to the coronavirus.
Additional comments?
Mr. President, I think that speaker has made a good point, and that's just now again, and that would direct that to Ms. Carlson and at LFD, that making sure that we can line item that money separately. Obviously, we would track it separately, but as well in our status sheet and our revenue picture, we want to be able to show that as a separate line item. I'm sure that you would do that. Is that correct, Ms. Carlson?
Absolutely, Senator Thomas. I mean, it's new, so we haven't figured out how yet, but we will very much keep those funds separate. According to the information we just got, we should expect those around April 24th. And we would anticipate having a revenue update early April, so we wouldn't have that cash yet. So we'd report through the end of March. Very minimal impacts or knowledge so far. I would anticipate a table similar to what Quinn had earlier, and then whatever revenue impacts we can see. Now, in those monthly reports, we'll definitely segregate monies so that you can see, you know, kind of below the surface of the details of what's going on with the 1.25 billion. We can report that separately. I'm very confident that we'll be able to isolate those expenditures. The executive has already set up accounting structures to be able to clearly identify what those expenditures are. So I think that they need to be able to report it to the federal government. So it should be very clear, and we should be able to report it to you very clear so that you can make whatever decisions that you need to make. So.
Thank you.
Mr. President, is Dan Bartel. Does anybody know, is Governor Bullock, can he, or have you heard that he might defer the property tax payments like we did with the income tax? And if so, what does that look like?
Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
I'll just say that it's too early to respond to what the governor's plans are in terms of actions that he can take. We're just pouring through the guidance, as Amy mentioned, and we got to get to a baseline here before we would consider that. And so that it's too soon to tell. But let me add, Mr. President, if I could, as we kind of head forward here, to follow up on what type of structure we might want to use to both keep our legislative colleagues in tune with what's going on, as well as contribute to the implementation of this CARES Act going forward. I would suggest that we rely on our legislative council. You know, it's an administrative committee. It's made up of all the leaders to try to provide some basic structure to a set of ongoing calls. This technology seems to be working very well. It does appear that there might be some limits to how many people can participate at any given time, but we'll have to work through that. But if the Legislative Council could commit to having a regular call, you know, maybe once a week, maybe more, we could decide that. And then if we could engage then the chairs of the other committees, particularly legislative finance, in asking them to participate and to provide briefings. We could, I think, probably address the need to really bring people to the table to interact with staff, get our briefings squared away, and then disseminate that information to our colleagues and if we then as council want to put together a meeting with the education committee, if we want to put a meeting together with the revenue committee, we could do that in a kind of a structured way. I would think that would get us to the goal that Senator Thomas was looking to achieve, and to provide a structured approach with the committees we've set up, with a reliance on legislative council, which represents the leadership, and then we could make decisions as we need to going forward, and legislative finance, both committees, I think, being more than capable of analyzing the information, asking the staff to do various tasks, and then decide on how to disseminate that information going forward. I would make that suggestion.
We'll look into that. We'll talk about it, and we'll counsel on it. Appreciate your input. Further questions, comments?
Yeah, Mr. President, this is Brad Cheetah again. Just a quick question regarding elections, because obviously they are being impacted by the entire virus and the fact that we're going to a mail-in ballot, but there still will be some who will be accessing ballots, paper ballots to fill out. Is there any process by which local elections departments who are going to be impacted would have access to the funds in the crisis? And I guess the same would be asked about the Secretary of State's office. Is there a path for them to access any of these funds in this bill?
I can't answer that question. Maybe one of our members, staff members, have some insight.
Mr. President, this is Fred, and I did look into that a little bit yesterday, last couple of days, because Representative Cheetah has a very good question. Couple things I could add to try and add some data to this question. One is that the mail ballot is less expensive. Two, current law narrows up the mail ballot so it doesn't include just sending out ballots to everybody that's registered. There's a process that they weed out voters that don't participate in the elections following each general election. And so in the general sense, if the county goes to a mail ballot, which is up to the county, my understanding, it's less expensive for them to do that. They would probably not have polling stations as they typically do. And it's less expensive, and not everybody gets ballots that's been on the rolls in the past. So someone was thinking ahead of the game when they did the work in the current statute and set it up, in my opinion.
So just to add a little bit, on Quinn's sheet on the first page, about halfway down, there are specific grants for election security. And in addition to that, the governor could use some portion of the $1.25 billion to help elections if he chose to.
Appreciate that. Further comments?
Mr.
President Sales, this is Representative Becky Beard.
Say again?
President Sales?
Yeah.
Becky
Who is it?
Beard here.
Oh, Becky.
Becky Beard. I just
Representative
wanted to circle
Beard.
back to, thank you. I wanted to circle back to Representative Bartel's question about property tax payments. In that, I checked with Department of Revenue Director last week. He said that this has been talked about. However, due to the immediate impact to local governments, to the counties who collect the funds, it was not being considered. However, I heard that under this CARES Act, mortgage companies are also looking into delaying requiring mortgage payments, which oftentimes includes an apportionment for the property tax collections. So I was wondering if there was anybody who was up to date on the discussions with the mortgage company's considerations.
Anybody out there? Doesn't sound like it.
Okay, we'll keep watching. Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Mr. President, this is Fred Thomas again. Just one last little thought on my part. I think it's clear, our attorney has laid this out very nicely and our staff has digested this many through on the ability of the governor to execute monies that are coming our way. One of the thresholds that I think we better nail down as quickly as we can, as Mr. Everts had addressed, is that term officer in the law, and that he talked about that earlier in this conversation. We all know that in this dire situation we find ourselves in, the one thing that isn't suspended is the Constitution, and we've got to follow the law. And so in that term officer, that needs to be dealt with and analyzed as quickly as possible. And hopefully there's a way that there's just said that, yep, it includes whoever it needs to include. But I think we better have that done because that's a very relevant question and one that needs to be behind us as timely as it can be.
Mr. President, this is Todd Everts. Senator Thomas, we will be doing that analysis expeditiously.
Great.
Appreciate that, Mr. Everts. Anything else for the
Mr.
good?
President,
Go ahead.
Mr. Everts, with your discussions with the federal senators, are you getting any indication as to when guidance from the Treasury Department may be coming down?
Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, they are waiting with bated breath for that guidance. The Treasury Department has about 30 days to provide that before they have to disperse that money to the states. Both the Senate staff said that the Treasury Department was working very quickly, but they didn't know within that 30 days when that was going to occur.
Further comments, questions? All right. I really appreciate our staff putting this little meeting together. It's been informative for myself, and I also appreciate the input from my colleagues in terms of a broader view of what we may need to take a look at. And Susan or Todd or Amy, anything you would like to say in closing?
Senator Sales, thank you. This is Susan Fox, and I just wanted to let you all know that we are continuing to work on this technology. Thank you so much. It was your investment in the legislative branch that's allowed us to kind of get these things up and running in a very short period of time. We will continue to refine it. We're still working on the public comment piece. And so as we learn more, we'll be in touch with you. Thank you for participating in this meeting. It gives you an idea of the technology we have and that we'll be offering to the interim committees. And then as you discuss how you want to get together and on a regular basis, we'll probably continue to use this technology. So I just wanted to thank you very much. We'll get together as staff and make sure that we've covered all the questions that you've proposed. And if you think of any other ones, please send them to me or Todd or Amy, and we will make sure that they get answered to for you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Todd or Amy, anything else?
Mr. President, I just wanted to ask whether we should announce another meeting now while we have everybody, and tuned in, if you will, just so we could kind of, have a follow-up Did you have a sense of what we should do in terms of moving forward?
Senator Sessa, I can't say that I do. Certainly, I don't know if it would hurt to have a legislative council meeting. If we could do that, or we can do this offline too. There's quite a little bit of information here that needs to be, I think, internalized and digested. And we know each other's contact information. We can be in touch with each other really rapidly. I would leave that up to the chairman of the legislative council. If in fact he thinks he wants to have a meeting, he could put that together.
Yeah, Mr. President, this is Representative Schreiner. I think that I would like to see some guidance come out. I think that some of these conversations, we have nowhere to go until we get some guidance and as of right now, like I said earlier, I think so much of this is at the discretion of the executive, and we don't really know without guidance what this looks like. So I do think it's a conversation that obviously will come up with our next legislative council meeting. I don't think we need to set time for that right now until we have more information.
Well, then I think then the prudent thing to do is to talk with one another as we go forward here, and if we see the necessity to meet again, we can do so.
Mr. President, this is Greg Hertz, and I'm sure Susan's working on this, but just continuing moving forward as operational for the legislative body, continuing to working on these type of meetings for interim committees, going forward to just being prepared should the legislature have to meet at some point in time before we're possibly out of this, or as we drag into it. We have our rules subcommittee that may be looking at different rules, but how do we formulate? How can we possibly meet electronically? What changes do we need to make? But I think just going forward, we need to probably concentrate on some of those issues as we're moving forward in this process.
Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, yes, I want you to know that that's what we are working on. First, we were trying to get this interim committee stuff kind of figured out in the technology, but it's also information that we can use. And Todd is helping. We're researching, if you had to have a special session, what are some options there? We're also working, we're just working on all that. And we've got a lot of the infrastructure set up should there be a special session. So that's one of the beauties of the technology that we have, that the staff has continued to work hard to be ready. And we know that right now the executive has a lot of the authority, but as soon as they need you and you want to get together, we are working to be totally prepared for that. So thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Well, this will conclude our meeting. I appreciate you folks taking the time out of your day to attend, and we'll be in touch. Stay safe.
Thank you, Mr. President.